You ever notice how some hearts give too much, too fast, too freely, until there's almost nothing left for themselves? There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that comes from always being available, always being agreeable, always bending yourself into a shape that makes others comfortable while you slowly disappear from your own center. And somewhere in that giving, you forget that your presence was never meant to be a sacrifice, never meant to be a place where everyone comes to take, but no one stays to understand. There is a difference between warmth and overextending yourself. One builds bridges, the other erases your own ground beneath your feet. When you become too friendly in the hope of being accepted, you begin to trade your boundaries for belonging. And that is a trade no soul survives forever without consequences. Because people will adjust to what you allow, not what you deserve. And so the question becomes not how kind you can be, but how much of yourself you are willing to lose in the name of being liked. Respect for yourself does not shout. It quietly refuses what diminishes you. It does not close the door on others. It simply stops, leaving yours wide open for those who never learn to knock. Being too friendly often looks harmless at first, even admirable, because kindness is praised in almost every society, and people are taught to value those who are easygoing and agreeable. But when friendliness is not guided by boundaries, it slowly turns into a pattern where a person starts saying yes to things they do not want, simply to avoid discomfort or rejection. This is where self-respect begins to weaken, not because the person is weak, but because the desire to be liked becomes stronger than the ability to protect personal space. Over time, the habit of overgiving creates an invisible pressure where the individual feels responsible for keeping others comfortable, even at the cost of their own energy, time, and emotional stability. They begin to measure their worth through how much they are needed, not through how much they are respected, and that shift quietly reshapes their identity in ways they do not immediately recognize in friendships, relationships, and even casual interaction. This often leads to blurred lines where personal limits are ignored because the person themselves has stopped enforcing them. What begins as being kind can slowly turn into being taken for granted because not everyone interprets constant availability as generosity. Some interpret it as permission. At this stage, the person may feel drained but still continue the same behavior because stepping back feels like risking disapproval or loneliness. The boundary between kindness and self-neglect becomes thin. And without awareness, a person can lose the quiet authority they once had over their own life. Personal boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about maintaining clarity on what is acceptable and what is not, so that relationships do not turn into one-sided spaces where only one person adjusts. When someone is too friendly without limits, they often become the default person for others' needs, expectations, and emotional demands, leaving little room for their own needs to be acknowledged or respected. This imbalance does not happen overnight. It grows gradually through repeated moments of silence, agreement, and self-adjustment that seem small individually, but accumulate into a lifestyle of self-erasure. The challenge is that people rarely notice the cost while it is happening, because the rewards of being liked and accepted can temporarily mask the loss of personal grounding. Eventually, the individual may feel unseen in their own life, not because others intentionally ignore them, but because they have slowly stopped asserting their presence with clarity. And in that silence of self-neglect, even simple requests begin to feel like obligations they cannot refuse, further reinforcing the cycle of over-friendliness without boundaries. At its core, this key point reminds us that friendliness without boundaries slowly replaces self-respect with approval-seeking behavior that feels harmless at first, but gradually becomes a way of living where the person forgets to pause and ask whether they are being valued or simply used. And this realization often arrives late, when the emotional exhaustion has already become deeply embedded in their daily life. And they start to the need for approval is something most people carry quietly, often without realizing how deeply it shapes their choices, reactions, and even their identity. It begins early, when being accepted by family, friends, or society feels like a measure of worth, and slowly it grows into a habit of looking outward before deciding what feels right inwardly. When a person becomes dependent on approval, their decisions stop being fully their own and start becoming reflections of what others might think, expect, or praise. This creates a subtle shift where life is no longer guided by personal truth, but by external validation. And in that shift, self-respect begins to weaken without loud warning signs. Respect for yourself does not come from being liked by everyone. It begins when you stop needing everyone's permission to exist as you are. When approval becomes the priority, even simple choices start to feel heavy. What to say, how to act, what to wear, or how to respond in conversations becomes filtered through the imagined reactions of others. This constant mental negotiation slowly distances a person from their authentic self, because they begin to shapeshift depending on who is watching. In doing so, they may gain acceptance, but it is often conditional and fragile, dependent on maintaining a version of themselves that pleases others rather than reflects who they truly are. Over time, this creates internal tension, because the self that is expressed outwardly and the self that exists privately begin to drift apart. Self-respect starts to emerge when a person begins to tolerate the discomfort of disapproval without collapsing into self-doubt. It is the moment when silence from others does not feel like rejection, and disagreement does not feel like failure. The need to constantly be validated loosens its grip, and in that space, personal values begin to speak more clearly. A person starts to understand that being respected does not require being universally approved, and that trying to win everyone's acceptance often leads to losing one's own direction. There is a quiet strength in choosing authenticity over approval. It means accepting that not every opinion needs to be followed, not every expectation needs to be met, and not every relationship will remain intact when boundaries are formed. But in return, something more stable is gained. A sense of inner grounding that does not fluctuate with praise or criticism. When approval is no longer the driving force, decisions become more aligned with personal truth, even if they are not popular or easily understood by others. This transition is not immediate. It happens gradually through small moments of choice. saying no without over-explaining, expressing an opinion without softening it for comfort, or walking away from situations that demand constant performance, all contribute to rebuilding self-respect. Each of these moments weakens the dependence on external validation and strengthens internal clarity. Over time, a person begins to realize that approval is temporary, often inconsistent, and shaped by changing moods and perspectives of others, while self-respect is something that remains steady when it is rooted in personal understanding rather than external agreement. And this realization slowly reshapes how they engage with the world around them, how they interpret silence from others, how they respond to praise, and how they stand firm in their own presence without needing constant reassurance from outside voices that once seemed necessary to move forward in every direction of life. Kindness is often seen as one of the purest human qualities, something that connects people and makes relationships meaningful. But when kindness has no boundaries, it can quietly turn into emotional exhaustion. This happens when a person gives their time, attention, and emotional energy without considering their own limits, believing that being available for everyone is the right thing to do at all times. At first, it feels fulfilling because helping others brings a sense of purpose and connection. However, when this giving becomes constant and one-sided, it begins to drain the inner reserves that are meant for personal healing, rest, and growth. Emotional exhaustion does not appear suddenly. It builds slowly through repeated patterns of overextending oneself. A person may start by being supportive in small ways, listening to others' problems, offering help, or being present whenever needed. But as expectations grow, so does the pressure to always respond, always fix, and always absorb what others are feeling. Without realizing it, the person becomes an emotional outlet for everyone around them, while having fewer spaces where their own emotions are acknowledged or cared for. This imbalance creates fatigue that is not physical but deeply internal, where even simple interactions begin to feel heavy. When kindness is given without limits, it often attracts dependency. Some people may begin to rely heavily on the constant availability of that kindness, expecting support without understanding the cost behind it. The kind person, in turn, may struggle to say no, fearing that refusal will make them seem cold or uncaring. This fear keeps them locked in a cycle where they continue to give, even when they are empty, believing that stopping would make them less valuable to others. Over time, this belief erodes their emotional well-being because they start equating their worth with how much they can endure for others. Emotional exhaustion also affects how a person sees themselves. They may begin to feel invisible in their own life as their needs are repeatedly pushed aside. Rest feels undeserved, silence feels uncomfortable, and stepping back feels like abandonment of others, even when it is necessary for survival. This constant outward focus leaves little room for inward reflection, and the person may slowly lose touch with their own feelings, desires, and limits. What remains is a tired version of kindness that no longer feels joyful but obligatory. True kindness does not require self-erasure. It exists in balance, where a person can care for others without abandoning themselves in the process. Without this balance, kindness turns into a silent burden, where the heart keeps giving even when it is no longer full. Learning to pause, to step back, and to recognize when emotional energy is running low is not selfish. It is necessary for sustaining genuine compassion over time. Eventually, a person begins to understand that constantly being emotionally available does not make relationships healthier, and that exhaustion, disguised as kindness, slowly removes the ability to feel present, connected, and steady in one's own life. As the weight of others' emotions continues to accumulate without space to release it properly, leading to a state where even caring begins to feel like a task rather than a choice. Learning to say no without guilt is one of the most important forms of emotional maturity, yet it is also one of the most difficult for many people because the word no often feels heavier than it actually is. From an early age, many are taught that being good means being agreeable, helpful, and available. So, over time, refusal begins to feel like something wrong rather than something natural. This creates an internal conflict where a person's instincts may want to decline a request, but their emotions push them toward agreement simply to avoid discomfort, disappointment, or judgment from others. In that space, guilt becomes a quiet controller of behavior, shaping decisions that should have been guided by personal limits instead of external pressure. Saying no is not an act of rejection. It is an act of definition. It defines where your energy ends and where someone else's expectation begins. But when guilt is involved, that definition becomes blurred, and the person starts to believe that every refusal must be justified, softened, or compensated with over-explanation or apology. This habit slowly weakens personal boundaries because every time a reluctant yes is given, it reinforces the idea that discomfort must be ignored in order to maintain peace. Over time, this creates a pattern where the individual becomes overcommitted, not because they want to be, but because they are afraid of how refusal might be perceived. The emotional weight of guilt often comes from imagining the disappointment of others more vividly than the exhaustion of oneself. A person may think about how their no will affect someone else's feelings, plans, or expectations, while ignoring how their constant yes affects their own mental space, time, and emotional balance. This imbalance of consideration slowly leads to resentment, not always toward others, but toward oneself for not having the courage to protect personal limits. That resentment can remain unspoken, but it shows up in fatigue, irritability, and a growing sense of being overwhelmed by commitments that were never fully chosen with clarity. Learning to say no without guilt requires understanding that boundaries are not barriers to connection. They are the structure that makes healthy connection possible. Without them, relationships become one-sided, where one person continuously gives and the other continuously receives without awareness of the cost involved. A guilt-free no does not come from indifference but from self-awareness, from recognizing that every yes carries a cost, and that cost is often time, energy, or emotional stability that cannot always be replenished immediately. When a person begins to practice saying no, they may initially feel uncomfortable, as if they are breaking an unspoken rule of being liked or accepted. But with repetition, that discomfort starts to fade, replaced by a quieter sense of control over one's own life. It becomes easier to distinguish between genuine willingness and obligation disguised as politeness. This shift does not make a person less kind. It makes their kindness more intentional because it is no longer forced or driven by fear of rejection. There is a subtle transformation that happens when guilt loses its authority over decisions, where choices begin to feel clearer, lighter, and more aligned with internal truth rather than external expectation. And in that space, the idea of refusal no longer feels like a fracture in relationships, but more like a necessary pause that protects what remains unspoken inside the person who has spent too long agreeing to everything that comes their way and still finds themselves wondering where their own space begins to exist. Self-respect is often misunderstood as distance, as if valuing oneself means withdrawing from others or building emotional walls that keep people out. In reality, self-respect is not about isolation. It is about balance, clarity, and the quiet understanding of how you allow yourself to be treated in any space you enter. It is the inner agreement you make with yourself that your presence has value, and that value should not be diminished by constant over-giving, over-explaining, or over-accepting situations that compromise your peace. When self-respect is present, relationships do not disappear. They become healthier because they are no longer built on imbalance or silent self-neglect. Many people confuse being overly accommodating with being respectful, believing that always adjusting to others is a form of kindness. But without self-respect, adjustment becomes self-erasure. You begin to shift your opinions, your time, and even your emotional needs to fit into spaces that do not necessarily honor your existence in return. This is where imbalance grows. People start to take more than they give, not always out of malice, but because the boundaries were never clearly defined. Self-respect changes this dynamic by quietly setting limits on what is acceptable, not through aggression, but through consistency in how you respond to disrespect, neglect, or disregard. Respecting yourself means recognizing that not every invitation needs acceptance, not every conversation needs participation, and not every relationship deserves unlimited access to your emotional world. It is understanding that your time is not endlessly expandable, and your energy is not meant to be distributed without thought. When you begin to operate from self-respect, you stop treating yourself as an unlimited resource for others' comfort. Instead, you begin to treat your own needs as equally important, not secondary or optional. One of the most powerful aspects of self-respect is its ability to reshape how others treat you. People often adjust their behavior based on what is consistently allowed. If you allow disrespect, inconsistency, or emotional disregard without response, it becomes normalized in your environment. But when self-respect is present, there is a quiet shift in energy. You no longer chase clarity from people who refuse to give it. You no longer over-explain your boundaries, and you no longer stay in spaces where your presence is constantly undervalued. This shift is not loud or confrontational. It is steady and firm, rooted in self-awareness rather than reaction. Self-respect also brings emotional stability. When you are not constantly trying to earn validation or adjust yourself to avoid rejection, your sense of identity becomes less dependent on external approval. You begin to feel more grounded in your choices, even when others do not understand them. This grounding creates a sense of inner peace that is not easily disturbed by criticism or approval, because your worth is no longer being negotiated in every interaction. At its core, self-respect is the ability to remain fully present in your life without abandoning yourself in the process of engaging with others. And it slowly transforms the way you experience relationships, decisions, and even silence, allowing you to exist in a way that is no longer shaped by constant compromise, but by a steady understanding that your presence deserves to be acknowledged without you having to reduce yourself to earn that acknowledgement